Okay, good morning, everyone. Today, I want to first thank you all for joining us. And for those of you who have been here with me for the other two workshops, welcome again. I hope that you are going to learn as much in this session. Our focus in the dLOC as Data series has been to think about questions around how we use um, digital collections, but also just archives in general in our work in Caribbean studies. And we've looked at different ways to think about newspaper data specifically. We've thought about how to help students generate ideas out of research. And so those are some the topics that we covered before. And in all of these conversations, we have considered or at least placed on um, the front of the conversation um, you know, what our role is as practitioners, as scholars, as researchers, archivists, activists in the work we do in putting those things together. We've talked a lot about using material in the first two sessions that I did. And today I would like us to focus a bit more on how we use what we use and why, as a framework for talking about our ethical reuse of data. Most of the collections that we'll find on uh, the dLOC website. And again, I will do a little poll to see how many people here are now familiar with the Digital Library of the Caribbean platform and interface. If you just use your reaction buttons, you can raise your hand to indicate if you are familiar with it or if you, yes, so I'm seeing a few. Right, okay. So about, see a few people here who have already. Thank you for that. I will touch on it a little bit later, but I say this because a lot of the content that we see in the collections and the collections involved in the dLOC as Data project are coming from digitization. Most of the collections are digitized products, not what we call born digital items, right? They have come from some type of print material that have been digitized in order to be made available. And some of those print materials are very fragile, have all kinds of contexts under which they were produced or which they are currently being stored, which makes digitization a really important part of our preservation and the sustainability of our working cultural heritage. However, there are considerations that we need to make in terms of how, from the point of accessing those collections in order to digitize them, all the way to the point of using those resources in our scholarship, in our research, in our activism, to think about the ethics of how we're doing that. And for this workshop, and part of the goal of the broader project is to think about this in the relationship to disaster. In the last 10 years specifically, the Caribbean has dealt with more regular, consistent, and severe climate disasters, particularly in terms of hurricanes. We've also seen in other types of disasters that are quote unquote natural disasters, but certainly influenced by colonial violence and other types of man-made considerations, such as the um, earthquake in Haiti in 2010. And so we want to think about what it means to come to resources and think about what the ethics are in how we use the work that we find there about disasters. So I want to just begin by outlining the goals of the workshop, and then I'm going to go to Matt for him to kick us off. What we will be doing today is I'm going to just share my screen very briefly, and then I'll stop after. Okay, so we just want to consider the following. Perry and Matt will make these slides available to you following the workshop, so I won't go into detail in each one, but you can follow along. This is a goal of what we want to talk about today. The strategies, challenges, and implications of scholarly encounters with data about disaster in the Caribbean, and to compare and contrast. This is where I've invited Matt to join me today for this workshop, because we do want to compare and contrast the experiences and ethical implications emerging from encounters with primary sources from research and from the point of view of publication. So we're looking at how we interact with physical collections and archives versus digital collections and archives, but also how we process ethical questions in the publication of those things, whether that's a monograph or a journal article or in a print publication versus digital scholarly publications like digital humanities projects, among others. So we're doing that compare and contrast, and Matt will really be leading the conversation about physical collections and print publications. We're discussing the issues of preservation, sustainability, and ownership involving primary sources, and the content, stories, and traumas found within these stories. And we're challenging harmful assumptions about access, ownership, and storytelling about disaster-related data. And we also want to consider the future of the Caribbean and Caribbean studies in the context of a constant reality of climate disaster. So these are sort of broad themes for us to think about, and we will, we will do them in this framework where we think about broad themes, gatekeepers, which we will talk about what gatekeeping has to do with ethics, encounters. I want to have a bit of a conversation around the notion of encounter and meeting texts and objects where they are, challenging our notions about discovery. Context, how and in what place we are finding ourselves, the sort of rhetorical situations in which we are using those resources, silences and traumas, and as well as narratives, what we produce out of what we find. So these are the framework for what we're talking about today. And I will now kick it over to Matt. Sorry. I went too fast and now I can't find my cursor. Okay, here we go. So I want to just frame what we're talking about it on a few premises, right? Caribbean studies have always operated in vulnerable times. Everything we study about the Caribbean has always been in the context of some type of vulnerability. Historically, we are the region itself is a product of trauma. The New World, the Colombian arrival is itself a traumatic event that led to our formation as we now understand it. And I'm thinking about the way colonial violence exists in relationship with natural and man-made disaster. But I also want to trouble the notion of the natural disaster in our context today, because what does natural mean when you are thinking about how external factors, including our history of violence, colonial violence, and plantation slavery, genocide of indigenous people, have led to a moment in which our ecological and socio-political configurations are deeply impacted by those traumatic historical events and moments. So I wanted to set that premise before I allow Matt to come in and think about the way we do this in terms of interacting with physical archives. So Matt, I'm going to stop sharing here and turn it over to you for a while, and then I'll come back.